That fluorescent hum. That's what Megan O'Brien heard first when the automatic doors of Cedar Creek Medical whispered open at 10:41 p.m. Not a greeting. Not a welcome. Just the low electrical drone of lights that had been burning since sunrise, waiting for night shift to arrive and take over the work nobody wanted to see. The parking lot behind her smelled like hot asphalt and diesel exhaust from the ambulance bay. Ahead of her, the hospital entrance glowed like a mouth swallowing her whole. 3 years. 1,095 nights. That's how long Megan had walked these corridors in scrubs the color of seafoam, her dark hair pinned back tight, her posture always military straight despite the careful slouch she'd trained herself to adopt. 3 years of keeping her hand steady while her voice stayed small. 3 years of being overlooked, dismissed, just another night nurse pushing medications and adjusting full lines while the day shift doctors made their rounds with their loud opinions and louder certainty. The other staff members didn't know her. They knew the version of her she'd constructed, careful, deferential, eager to please. They did not know Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, decorated for valor in 17 combat extractions across 3 tours in Baghdad, had ever existed at all. The badge reader beeped. The security guard, a man named Holloway who'd never made eye contact with her in 36 months, glanced up from his desk and looked away again. She moved through the lobby where the vending machines hummed their own low song, past the bulletin boards announcing staff anniversaries and new parking regulations, down the corridor where her footsteps made no sound on the linoleum because she'd learned long ago how to walk invisible. The ICU was her assignment tonight, beds 1 through 8, plus the corner isolation room where the complicated cases lived. The night supervisor, a woman named Patricia whose voice could cut through a code blue from 50 paces, handed Megan her assignment sheet without comment. For patients. 1 post-op cardiac. 1 sepsis case. 1 elderly diabetic with neuropathy. And bed 7, Marcus Webb, retired Marine, mute since a firefight in Baghdad approximately 6 years ago, current complaint respiratory distress and unstable vitals for the past 72 hours. Megan's jaw tightened for half a second when she read the name. Marcus Webb. Not a common name, but not impossible either. She forced her face back to stone and took the chart. The ICU smelled like it always did, antiseptic layered over floor, polish layered over something underneath that no amount of cleaning could remove. It was the smell of the body's failures, she thought. All the chemical courage in the world couldn't mask what happened when human machinery broke down. She moved to bed 7, where Marcus Webb lay with his head tilted back and his eyes half closed, watching the ceiling as if it might reveal something. His left arm lay across the blanket, the 4 in the crook of his elbow taped with careful precision, and on his forearm. There. Faded black ink. A tattoo maybe 2 inches long. The letters O'Brien. Just the name. No date, no unit designation, no rank. Just a name somebody had thought was important enough to carry into battle, and then important enough to carry home. Megan's hands did not shake. She would not allow them to shake. She checked his blood pressure, 108/72, elevated for him based on the chart notes, and made a notation with her pen, the same blue pen she'd been using for 3 years, and she did not look at the tattoo again. Did not think about who might have worn that name. Did not think about the firefight in the Jolan district on a night when the temperature had dropped to 42 degrees and they'd extracted 14 personnel with 2 KIA and 1 who'd caught fragmentation wounds across his vocal cords and never spoken a word since. Did not think about any of that. She tucked the challenge coin deeper into her pocket where it wouldn't slip out again. The coin was tarnished, deliberately so, pressed from aircraft wreckage and shrapnel collected after the mission went sideways, and it carried an inscription on the back that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't know the code name. Archangel. That's what they'd called her. Not Master Chief. Not Megan. Archangel. She'd never told anyone at Cedar Creek about the coin. It was a relic. A museum piece from a life that was supposed to stay classified, supposed to stay buried, supposed to stay exactly where the Pentagon had filed it away, permanently redacted, forever compartmentalized, and never mentioned again. Marcus Webb made a sound in his throat. Not quite a groan. Something thinner than that. She adjusted his oxygen cannula and made another note. His oxygen saturation was at 88%. That would need attention, maybe an increase in flow rate, maybe a conversation with the day team about whether they needed to escalate his care. She moved on to bed 6, then 5, then 4, completing her initial assessment of the shift's patients the way she'd completed it 1,000 times before, with precision, with attention, with the kind of methodical focus that came from having once needed to keep people alive under enemy fire. It was 12:34 a.m. when Dr. Caldwell appeared in the ICU. He moved through the unit like he owned it, which in a manner of speaking, he did. Dr. James Caldwell, 47 years old, board-certified in internal medicine, with a voice that carried the kind of certainty that only came from a lifetime of never being questioned. His shoes were expensive, Italian leather, Megan noticed without looking directly at him, and his watch was the kind of thing that cost more than her car. He carried a tablet and a cup of coffee from the private physician's lounge where the real coffee lived, not the burnt sludge from the ICU machine. He moved to the central station where the nurses tracked their patients, where their charts lived, where all the documentation accumulated. Megan was reviewing the cardiac patient's imaging orders when Caldwell passed. The orders had caught her attention during the shift handoff. A full cardiac MRI with contrast. Expensive. Probably $15,000 in imaging costs. The patient was a 73-year-old female with stable angina and no recent change in symptomatology. The previous cardiac imaging from 4 months ago showed no significant coronary disease. Nothing in the clinical presentation suggested she needed a new MRI now. And yet there it was in the system, ordered that morning by Caldwell himself, scheduled for the following day. Megan did something she rarely did. She asked a question. She approached the central station where Caldwell was reviewing another patient's labs, keeping her voice low and her tone deferential the way she'd learned to do. "Excuse me, Dr. Caldwell. I was reviewing Mrs. Chen's chart, bed 4, and I noticed the new MRI order. Was there a recent EKG change I missed in my assessment, or she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to." His eyes found hers, and something flickered across his expression. A freeze. A moment where the professional mask slipped just fractionally and she saw underneath it something that looked like anger. Then the mask returned. The smile came next, not a warm smile, but a precise one, calibrated and deployed like a tool. "Just routine," he said. "Comprehensive assessment. Prevention is better than cure, wouldn't you say?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked away, his footsteps confident, his posture unchanged, but Megan had seen what was underneath. She had seen men like him before, men who did not appreciate being questioned, men who understood power and how to wield it. She looked down at Mrs. Chen's chart and made a note about the vital signs she'd just taken. Her hand did not tremble. She would not let it tremble. Not here. Not in front of anyone. The old training came back easily enough, the part about composure, about never showing fear or doubt, about keeping your expression neutral when your mind was already 3 moves ahead, already calculating what came next. The rest of the shift proceeded in silence. Megan completed her rounds, monitored her patients, responded to call lights, coordinated with the respiratory therapist about Marcus Webb's increasing oxygen requirements. At 3:17 a.m., she stood at the edge of Marcus's bed and adjusted his oxygen cannula to 4 liters per minute, watching his oxygen saturation climb from 87 to 91%, and she did not think about the fact that his tattoo was still visible on his forearm, still reading her name, still a silent accusation of everything she'd left behind. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 3:42 a.m. when she walked past the physician's lounge and saw Dr. Caldwell through the glass window. He was on his phone. His free hand was gesturing with sharp, aggressive movements. His jaw was clenched. And as she passed, he looked directly at her, held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds, and she understood in that moment with the kind of certainty that only came from years of reading hostile intent that something had shifted. That her question about the imaging order, the smallest of queries, the most deferential of challenges, had registered as a threat. She continued to the supply room to restock her medication cart. She pulled open the locked cabinet where the controlled substances lived and began counting the ampules of medication, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had performed this task 1,000 times. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. Her expression would show anyone who happened to look that she felt nothing at all. Behind her, somewhere in the hospital's deeper corridors, Dr. Caldwell was making decisions. Making phone calls. Making sure that whoever this night nurse was, whoever thought she had the right to question his orders, whoever believed they occupied some equal plane of authority, would understand exactly where they stood in Cedar Creek Medical's hierarchy. He had power. He had connections. He had the kind of institutional authority that came from being useful to people who mattered. Megan O'Brien was invisible. Expendable. And in exactly 4 hours and 19 minutes, she was going to learn exactly how fragile that invisible status really was. She closed the medication cabinet. She locked it. She returned to the ICU, where Marcus Webb lay in bed 7 with her name tattooed on his arm, waiting for a rescue neither of them could have predicted was about to arrive. The fluorescent lights hummed on. The Grand Rounds conference room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like burnt coffee and institutional anxiety. 20 residents stood in neat rows, their white coats crisp and pressed, their pens poised over notepads like soldiers waiting for orders. Megan entered from the back, finding her place against the painted cinder block wall, her hands already clasped behind her back in the military stance that had become her default when forced into spaces where she didn't belong. Dr. Caldwell stood at the projection screen, her patient chart blown up to 6 feet tall behind him. His tailored suit caught the fluorescent light like polished armor. He hadn't glanced at Megan when she entered. He was saving that moment. "Let me show you an example," Caldwell began, his voice smooth as surgical steel, "of dangerously substandard documentation." He turned slowly, deliberately, letting the words land before he continued. "Patient presents with dyspnea, jugular venous distension, and muffled heart sounds. Apparently, Nurse O'Brien believes she possesses the diagnostic acumen of a cardiologist." He read her observations aloud in a mocking sing-song cadence, each syllable sharpened to cut. The residents exchanged glances. One smirked. Another scribbled notes. 3 years on night shift, Caldwell continued, "and this is what we get, a nurse who confuses competent observation with medical expertise. The dangerous assumption that bedside care qualifies one to make assessments that belong exclusively to physicians." He turned the page. "Notice here, she documents concerning pattern in imaging orders. Notice the hubris. The audacity." He smiled at the residents like a professor revealing a fundamental truth about human weakness. "We should call this O'Brien syndrome," he said. "The delusional belief that 3 years of changing bedpans equals a medical degree. Gentlemen, this is what happens when accountability disappears on night shift. This is what we're dealing with." Megan's jaw clenched. Once. Then nothing. Her face returned to stone, a discipline learned in Baghdad when insurgents watched for fear, when showing pain was a weapon they could use against you. Her breathing remained steady. Her eyes stayed fixed on a point above Caldwell's head. Not defiant. Not afraid. Just absent. The residents didn't look at her. Nobody looked at her. She was already erased. Caldwell turned away and continued discussing a different patient, dismissing her from his narrative as completely as he'd dismissed her credentials. The message was clear: she was beneath discussion, beneath consideration, already broken. At 11 o'clock, Megan stood near the vending machines in the break room, waiting for her coffee to finish brewing in the ancient machine that gurgled like a dying animal. 2 interns stood 3 feet away, whisper-laughing with the careful volume of predators aware that their prey could hear them. "I heard Caldwell's got security on speed dial for her," one said, loud enough for Megan to register every word. "Like, he's apparently building a file. Making copies of everything she does. O'Brien syndrome is contagious," the other intern laughed. "He's been telling everyone she's a liability. She's done." Megan's hand trembled exactly 0 times. She added cream to her coffee. 2 sugars. Stirred counterclockwise 3 times. The movements were methodical, practiced, immune to the noise around her. She set the ceramic mug down with a soft clink against the break room counter, no spill, no shake, no sign of the kind of emotional volatility that would confirm Caldwell's narrative. She walked past the interns without acknowledgement. Not coldly, that would have given them the satisfaction of knowing they'd affected her. Just neutrally, the way you'd walk past a television playing in a waiting room. Present but not present. Here but somewhere else entirely. The intern's laughter faded as she moved into the hallway. At 1 o'clock, Caldwell positioned himself in the ICU corridor with the precision of someone staging a scene. He waited until Megan rounded the corner, ensuring 4 nurses and a respiratory therapist would witness whatever he was about to say. The setup was flawless. The timing was perfect. He had become very good at this. "Nurse O'Brien," he called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people stop and listen. "A moment." She approached. Her spine stayed straight. Her voice remained flat and serviceable when she spoke. "Of course, Doctor. I need to ensure we have clarity," he said, his tone dropping into something more dangerous than anger. It was the voice of someone explaining reality to someone who couldn't be trusted to understand it. Questioning physician orders. Making diagnostic observations beyond your scope. Documenting findings that contradict attending assessments. These are career-ending behaviors. Do you understand, or do I need to have this conversation with security present? The interns watched. The respiratory therapist pretended to adjust a monitor. "I understand, Doctor," Megan said. "Good." He smiled, and the smile was the worst part because it contained certainty. "I'd hate for someone with your limited options to lose this position. It's not easy to get hired again once your credibility is destroyed, is it?" She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. "No, sir." He walked away satisfied, already composing the narrative in his head, the unstable nurse, the insubordinate attitude, the dangerous scope creep that forced his hand. He was the victim in this story, protecting his department, protecting standards, protecting the vulnerable residents from someone who couldn't stay in her lane. The other nurses still wouldn't meet Megan's eyes as she returned to the ICU. That was fine. Eye contact implied alliance. An alliance was a liability she couldn't afford. At 1:30, she checked Marcus Webb's vital signs and felt the first real spike of concern. His heart rate had climbed to 104. His blood pressure was drifting down, 92/58 and falling. His neck veins were beginning to distend. She listened to his heart sounds through her stethoscope and heard them immediately, the hallmark of cardiac tamponade, that terrifying muffled quality that meant fluid was compressing his heart with every beat. She paged the on-call resident immediately. No answer. She paged again at 1:45. Still nothing. She documented everything with the precision that had served her in the field, each observation clinical and beyond reproach. The handwriting was steady because her hands had learned steadiness in environments where shaking hands meant dead Americans. She noted the vital sign trajectory, the cardiac findings, the imaging inconsistencies Caldwell had somehow gotten ordered despite this patient presenting with no cardiac history. In the stairwell outside the ICU, she heard Caldwell's voice carrying down from the floor above, speaking into his phone with the casual confidence of someone who had already won. "The Medicare audit won't find anything if we redirect attention to a rogue nurse," he was saying. "Yes, I have documentation ready. She's already questioned my orders multiple times. No, she has no credibility left, no support structure, nowhere to go. By the time we're finished, she'll be radioactive." Megan continued past the stairwell door without breaking stride, but her hand found the challenge coin in her scrub pocket, the tarnished disc of metal that carried her entire life compressed into something small enough to hold in a closed fist. At 1:45, she pulled up Marcus Webb's complete imaging history and saw the pattern crystallize with sudden, undeniable clarity. 17 cardiac imaging studies in 30 days. Each one billable. Each one unnecessary. Each one ordered by Caldwell. The math was simple: if even 2 of those scans were medically unjustified, he was looking at approximately $12,000 in fraudulent Medicare billing on a single patient. A pattern like that across his entire service census would be catastrophic. He had destroyed her credibility to protect his criminal conduct. At 1:58, Megan checked on Marcus again. His oxygen saturation was dropping. His blood pressure had fallen to 76/42. The heart sounds were barely audible now, as if his heart was drowning in fluid. At 2 o'clock exactly, every monitor in the ICU screamed at once. Marcus Webb's cardiac rhythm deteriorated. His blood pressure flatlined. His oxygen saturation plummeted. The on-call resident came sprinting in, saw the monitors, and froze like a small animal caught in headlights, his mind clearly searching for the protocol he'd learned in medical school and finding only static. "I need to page cardiology," he stammered. "He'll be dead in 4 minutes," Megan said quietly. It wasn't prediction. It was diagnosis. The attending physician at the nurse's station heard something in her voice and moved back from the bed instinctively, as if making space for someone with authority he suddenly recognized. Megan's hands were already moving. The ultrasound probe materialized in her grip with muscle memory that transcended her civilian role. She marked the anatomical landmarks on Marcus's chest, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, where the pericardial fluid would be compressing his heart with every beat. The ultrasound confirmed it immediately, a pericardial effusion the size of a grapefruit, a tension physiology that would kill him in minutes if it wasn't drained. But that wasn't the worst part. At 1:41 p.m., Megan checked Marcus Webb's monitor and felt the familiar weight settle behind her ribs, the kind of weight that comes from recognizing a pattern no one else has seen yet. His heart rate had climbed to 118. His blood pressure had dropped to 94/52. The trends were moving in the wrong direction, fast, and the ultrasound machine in the corner of the ICU was about to confirm what her instincts had already screamed. She rolled the probe across his chest with the precision of someone who'd performed this motion 1,000 times in conditions far worse than a climate-controlled hospital room. The pericardial sac appeared on the screen as a dark crescent moon surrounding his heart, blood, pooling where blood should never be, compressing the chambers with every beat. A pericardial effusion the size of a grapefruit. Not aspirated. Not observed. Not managed. It would kill him in minutes if it wasn't drained, and the window was closing. Megan's face remained neutral, but her mind was already moving through the procedure like a chess master playing 5 moves ahead. She'd done this before, not in the sterile comfort of a hospital with attending physicians standing by and crash carts staged in the hallway, but in a field hospital outside Fallujah with incoming fire rattling the tin roof and a Marine whose blood type she still remembered without thinking. She reached for her phone and paged the on-call resident. Dr. Parsons. 26 years old, 3 months into his cardiology rotation, competent enough on rounds when someone was walking him through the logic but untested when the clock started running. No response. She waited 90 seconds, watching Marcus's oxygen saturation begin its slow drift downward. 96 to 94. 94 to 91. The monitor's rhythm was starting to show the electrical equivalent of a man suffocating from inside his own chest cavity. She paged again. Marked it urgent. Waited while the pneumatic system of the hospital carried her message somewhere into the administrative spaces where Dr. Parsons was probably reviewing imaging files or grabbing lunch in the physician's lounge. 2 minutes passed. No answer. Megan set the phone down and made a clinical decision that would change everything. She gathered the pericardiocentesis kit from the crash cart, 18-gauge needle, sterile drapes, the thin fluoroscopic guidance equipment that turned a blindfolded procedure into something with actual margins for error. Around her, the ICU hummed its steady mechanical rhythm, ventilators wheezed, monitors beeped their syncopated warnings, the cooling system hissed through overhead vents like distant exhalation. At 2 p.m. exactly, Marcus Webb's heart decided it had had enough. The monitor's rhythm collapsed into chaos. Ventricular fibrillation. Raw electrical noise instead of organized beats. His blood pressure evaporated. 0/0. The kind of cardiac arrest that meant his heart had stopped contracting, and without immediate intervention, there were maybe 4 minutes before his brain started dying. Maybe less. The on-call resident, Dr. Parsons, froze in the doorway like he'd been flash-frozen mid-stride. His hands hung at his sides. His mouth opened and closed. Megan watched the color drain from his face in real time, watched the cascade of cognitive failure that happens to smart people when they realize they are genuinely unprepared for what's in front of them. He was a competent physician. He was a good reader of literature. But he had never held a human heart survival in the narrow space between his own two hands, and it showed. Megan moved. She didn't run. She didn't announce herself. Her hands were already steady as she positioned the sterile field across Marcus's chest, her movements carrying the kind of economical precision that marked someone who'd done this under conditions that demanded perfection. 50 milliliters of blood in the pericardial sac was enough to stop a man's heart completely. She'd seen worse. She'd operated on worse. She'd saved lives in conditions that would have made this sterile, calm hospital room feel like a luxury resort. The needle went in at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, angled 45 degrees toward the left shoulder. Not too fast. Not too shallow. The kind of micro-adjustments that lived in the muscle memory of someone who'd performed this procedure while the ground shook from mortar rounds and the smell of diesel and blood mixed with the antiseptic alcohol prep. Angles perfect, the attending physician whispered, his voice carrying genuine disbelief. She's done this before. A lot. The needle advanced. The resistance changed. That specific tactile sensation of entering the pericardial sac, it was like unlocking a door that only certain hands knew how to find. Megan didn't hesitate. Didn't adjust unnecessarily. Just advanced with the confidence of someone who'd already survived the worst conditions imaginable and knew that hesitation killed people faster than bullets. Dark blood flowed back through the needle. 50 milliliters. Then another 50. Then another. The compressed heart began to expand. The monitor that had been screaming chaotic nonsense started organizing itself, first into irregular bursts, then into something approaching a rhythm. Marcus's pressure climbed. 40 over 30. 60 over 40. 78 over 50. The slow resurrection of a man's vital signs as his heart expanded and began to function again. 90 seconds. That was all the procedure took. The kind of time that usually didn't matter in medicine, the kind of interval you could waste waiting for a chart to print or a junior resident to find the right imaging file. But in the 90 seconds between cardiac arrest and resuscitation, 90 seconds was the difference between living and dying, between a man with a name who could feel the sun and a body that would be donated to science. Marcus Webb's eyes opened. His hand, the one that wasn't paralyzed, reached out and gripped Megan's wrist with the desperate gratitude of someone who understood, even without speech, that he'd been one heartbeat away from ending. His fingers were cold and trembling, but his grip was strong, the grip of a Marine who still had strength left and was directing every ounce of it toward the person who'd just pulled him back from the edge. Megan met his eyes for exactly 1 second. She didn't nod. Didn't smile. Didn't acknowledge what they both knew, that this moment had just rewritten his entire survival story in a way that would ripple outward through the rest of his life. She simply squeezed his hand once, then stepped back and began cleaning up the procedure site with the same methodical precision she'd used to save him. The attending was still staring at her with the expression of a man watching a performance he hadn't expected to witness. Dr. Parsons had found his voice somewhere, was calling for a post-procedure EKG and repeat imaging to confirm the effusion was draining correctly. Around them, nurses moved to stabilize Marcus, to confirm his vitals, to push medications that would prevent reaccumulation. The room had moved into its post-crisis protocol with the smooth urgency of a unit that had seen this before. Megan stripped her gloves and deposited them in the biohazard container. Her face showed nothing. Her breathing was controlled. Her hands weren't shaking, they were steady as a surgical laser, steady as they'd been in a field hospital outside Fallujah, steady as they'd been holding the lives together that no one was supposed to know she'd ever touched. But that wasn't the worst part. In the hallway outside Marcus's room, Dr. Caldwell had watched the entire procedure through the doorway window with an expression that moved through shock and into something colder. Something calculated. Something that looked like a man watching his institutional leverage disintegrate in 90 seconds of clinical excellence he couldn't publicly explain without asking questions he didn't want answered. He was on his phone before Megan even finished disposing of the needle. First call, the hospital board chairman, a man named Sterling who owed him favors from a malpractice settlement they'd buried together 2 years ago. Megan heard the words through the doorway: liability concern, scope creep, questions about credentials. The second call went to the Texas Medical Board, some contact Caldwell had cultivated, another debt being called in. I need a complaint filed. Pericardiocentesis. No physician supervision. Document it as exceeding scope of practice. His voice was smooth, confident, the kind of professional tone that made terrible action sound like reasonable precaution. The third call was to a private investigator named Mercer. Background check. Comprehensive. I want employment history, military service, and yes, there will be military service. Night shift nurse at a community hospital doesn't move like that unless she's special operations. I want to know what she's hiding, and I want it before her shift ends today. At 2:45 p.m., Megan was cleaning the ultrasound probe when security arrived, 2 officers in polo shirts with the Cedar Creek Medical logo, the kind of security presence that was never called unless someone important had already decided something was wrong. Ms. O'Brien, HR needs to see you immediately. Megan looked at Marcus Webb one last time. His eyes were closed now, but his monitor was steady. Sinus rhythm. Blood pressure normalized. A man alive who'd been dead 10 minutes earlier. She nodded once at the security officers and followed them without a word, without protest, without the tremor in her hands that would have been natural for someone who didn't already know how to walk toward the worst while keeping her face like stone. Dr. Caldwell entered the ICU at 2:56 p.m., his face carefully composed, his eyes moving from the cardiac monitor to Marcus Webb, stabilizing vitals to Megan's hands, still steady, still precise, moving through the post-procedure assessment with the efficiency of someone who had performed this exact maneuver in conditions far worse than a sterile hospital room. He said nothing. His smile was thin, sharp as a scalpel, and when his gaze locked onto Megan's for exactly 1 second, she saw the calculation behind it. He had witnessed something he couldn't control, and control was the only language Dr. Caldwell spoke fluently. He turned and walked out. Megan continued her work. Heart rate stabilizing. Oxygen saturation climbing, 88, 91, 94. The pericardial fluid had compressed the right ventricle until the organ couldn't fill properly. One needle, positioned correctly, had changed everything. The fluid drained, the pressure released, the heart remembered how to beat. Marcus Webb would live. This was what mattered. This was the only equation that moved her. But Dr. Caldwell had already moved into the next calculation entirely. The first phone call came at 2:52 p.m. from his office on the 3rd floor. Megan wasn't there to hear it, but the hospital administrator would describe it later to the investigators, Caldwell's voice smooth and unhurried, reminding the hospital board chairman about the $400,000 in orthopedic equipment donations Caldwell had personally solicited 3 years ago, asking politely if the chairman remembered that conversation, if they understood how grateful the hospital had been for such generous support. The board chairman had stammered something about professional courtesy. Caldwell had laughed, not unkindly, and explained that he'd just witnessed a dangerous protocol violation that needed to be addressed immediately, that he would need the board's full support in this matter, and that he was confident they would stand with him when the complaint was filed. The donation was mentioned twice more in that 6-minute conversation, though never directly. It didn't need to be. The second phone call went to the Texas Medical Board at 2:58 p.m. Caldwell had a colleague there, someone who owed him a favor from a credentialing committee recommendation 2 years prior. The complaint was meticulously worded. Dr. Caldwell reported that a registered nurse, name withheld pending official investigation, had performed an advanced cardiac procedure without physician supervision, without authorization, without the presence of a board-certified cardiologist, potentially endangering patient safety. The complaint didn't mention that the patient would have been dead without that procedure. The complaint didn't mention that the attending cardiologist was currently in a meeting and unreachable. The complaint didn't mention that Caldwell himself had been present in the ICU the entire time. The complaint mentioned only violation of scope of practice, unauthorized intervention, and unsafe patient care. By regulation, the board would have to open an investigation. The third phone call was to a private investigator at 3:04 p.m., a former detective named Harrison who had helped Caldwell before, who understood discretion, who knew how to pull records that were supposed to be sealed. Caldwell wanted a complete work history, every employment record, any military service if it existed, any gaps in her employment timeline, any reason to build a narrative around her sudden arrival at Cedar Creek Medical 3 years ago. He wanted it fast. He would pay whatever it cost. He was very interested in understanding who this nurse really was, because someone who moved with that kind of confidence, who performed procedures that precisely under that much pressure, didn't arrive from nowhere. There was a story. He wanted to know it. Megan stood in the ICU at 3:41 p.m., unaware that her employment history was already being excavated, that her records were being flagged, that 3 separate institutional mechanisms had been triggered to move against her. She completed Marcus Webb's post-procedure assessment, confirmed with the attending cardiologist that everything was stable, and then watched as the attending, a decent woman named Dr. Martinez, suddenly looked uncomfortable and said quietly, "There's been a complaint filed with HR. You should probably go up there now." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the soft voice of someone who liked Megan but had no power in what was coming. The HR office on the 5th floor was beige and fluorescent lit, the kind of space designed to strip away context and dignity. The director, a man named Patterson whose name tag said Director of Personnel Services, didn't meet Megan's eyes as she sat down across from his desk. He had a folder in front of him, thin, hastily assembled. He opened it slowly, the way people do when they're uncomfortable with what they're about to say. Effective immediately, Patterson began, reading from a prepared statement that Dr. Caldwell had almost certainly helped him compose. "Your employment is terminated for performing medical procedures without physician supervision, exceeding the scope of nursing practice, and unauthorized patient interventions that violated hospital protocol." Patterson looked up for the first time. His expression was apologetic. "Dr. Caldwell has filed a formal complaint with the Texas Medical Board. They'll be contacting you directly." Megan's face was stone. "I saved his life." "You violated protocol," Patterson replied, his voice gentle but firm. "That's all that matters in a liability situation. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. You're not authorized for patient care areas anymore. You're done here." She stood. The chair made no sound as she pushed it back. "I'd like to see my patient. Marcus Webb. Just for a moment. 2 minutes." "I'm sorry. That's not possible." The door to the hallway opened. Dr. Caldwell filled the doorway, his arms crossed in front of his chest like a man who had already won, like this moment had been inevitable, like she had been a problem waiting to be solved and the solving was complete. His smile was luminous with triumph. "Request denied," Caldwell said. His voice carried the cadence of someone reading a verdict. "You're no longer authorized for patient care areas. You're a terminated employee. You have 30 minutes to clear your locker and leave the building. Security is waiting downstairs." Megan looked at him. She didn't look away. Her eyes were the color of a winter ocean, and Caldwell's certainty wavered for just a moment, long enough for her to move past him without a word, long enough for her to walk through the hallway with her spine straight and her breathing controlled, long enough for everyone watching to see that something in her had shifted into a different mode entirely. Her hands were clenched at her sides, though. Just for a moment. Just tight enough that the nails pressed crescents into her palms. Then she relaxed them. Control. Always control. The basement laundry facility at 6:24 p.m. was fluorescent bright and empty, a cavernous room with industrial washers and dryers, folding tables, and metal shelving that held hundreds of sets of scrubs in different sizes and shades. The air was thick with steam and detergent, the smell of hospital industrialized into something harsh and medicinal. Megan was alone. Security had delivered her locker contents, not much. A personal photo in a cheap frame. A hairbrush. A pair of compression socks. A small emergency kit with bandages and antiseptic ointment. Her 3-year employee ID. Her white coat with her name embroidered in blue thread. She started folding her scrubs. The ones she'd worn on night shift, the ones with the ink stain on the left thigh from a broken pen, the ones that carried the weight of 3 years of 12-hour shifts and code blues and patients who had lived because she was careful and competent and relentless. She folded them the way the Corps had taught her, precise, geometric, with corners sharp enough to cut. Fold along the center seam. Crease the sleeves. Fold the body in half. Crease again. Stack them. Start over. The repetition was meditative. The repetition was grief. The repetition was the last remaining ritual from a life she couldn't acknowledge, performed in a basement laundry facility in San Antonio, Texas, because that was what had been taken from her. Her hand moved through the folds with absolute precision. Muscle memory. The hands had held lives together in Fallujah when the building collapsed. The hands had performed emergency surgical airways in Sanjan Valley when the medic was down. The hands had extracted 12 wounded Marines through a minefield while rounds cracked overhead and the night was lit by muzzle flashes and she was called only by a call sign, a ghost, something the military would later officially deny ever existed. And now those hands folded scrubs in a basement and followed the protocols of 3-year employment termination. She was folding the 7th pair when the challenge coin slipped from her front pocket. The movement was sudden, the sound sharp, a tarnished piece of brass and zinc hitting concrete floor and ringing out like a small bell in the vast empty space. The coin spun twice and settled. Megan looked at it. The coin was weathered, its edges worn from 3 years in her pocket during shifts, the inscription still readable, Baghdad 2009, Archangel. It was the only physical proof that the person who had taken that call sign had ever existed. The Pentagon had erased her records, redacted her service, buried her operations in classified files that would probably stay sealed for another 40 years. The military had told her to disappear, to become someone else, to walk away from everyone and everything. She had done exactly that. She had become a nurse named Megan O'Brien who saved lives during night shifts and never mentioned that she'd already saved thousands of lives in conditions where the word mercy had a different definition entirely. She sat on the folding table and picked up the coin. The weight of it felt exactly like it always did, negligible and infinite all at once. Her hands trembled. For the first time all day, after the humiliation and the procedure and the firing and Caldwell's triumph, her hands shook. She was alone. She was entitled to shake. She pressed the coin between her palms and sat in the steam and the fluorescent light and allowed herself, for exactly 3 minutes, to break. No one was watching. No one would see it. At 6:48 p.m., the hospital's front entrance doors burst open like something explosive had detonated on the other side. A 16-year-old boy with Megan's jaw and Megan's eyes ran through the lobby carrying a shadow box, his voice cracking with desperation and righteous teenage fury. Mom. Mom, they need to see these. The lobby was busy, evening shift change, visitors arriving, staff moving between stations, and then it wasn't busy anymore. Everything stopped. People turned. The security desk looked up. 2 nurses froze mid-conversation. The boy was running straight toward the information desk, holding the shadow box like it was the most important thing he'd ever carried in his life. Which it was. Derek O'Brien hit the glass doors doing 40 miles an hour, carrying the shadow box like a battering ram. The medals caught the fluorescent lights as he ran, brass gleaming in stutters of gold and silver. His voice cracked and soared at the same time, the kind of shout only a 16-year-old can manage when he's terrified and proud simultaneously. Mom. Mom, they need to see these. 73 staff members turned. That's how many were in Cedar Creek's lobby at 6:36 p.m. 3 nurses at the information desk. 2 residents. For orderlies restocking the supply station. Security guards. Visitors. The lobby became a held breath. Derek's sneakers squeaked on tile as he skidded toward the center of the room, the shadow box raised like a torch. Megan was at the vending machine on the 4th floor. She heard her son's voice carry through the elevator shaft like a bell. She didn't move. She didn't need to. She already knew what was about to happen. Marcus Webb's night nurse was a former Army corpsman named Thomas Halloway, 23 years old, with a tattoo of a caduceus on his left wrist and the kind of eyes that had seen field dressing and arterial bleeding. He was standing near the admissions desk when Derek reached the center of the lobby, shadow box held high. Halloway saw the face in the old deployment photograph first. The photograph was 8 inches by 10 inches, color faded to the amber of old memories. It showed a woman in desert camouflage, face streaked with dust and something darker, eyes that looked like they'd already seen too much. But it was the call sign printed in faded white beneath the image that made Halloway's blood stop moving. Archangel. The name fell from his mouth as a whisper. Archangel. One word. That's all it took. 2 older men in the waiting room stood. Not slowly. Not questioningly. They stood like they'd been given a command, the kind of synchronization that only happens when muscle memory recognizes authority. One of them was 72 years old and wore a cardigan. The other was pushing 80, white hair thin as cloud cover. They stood at attention. Not formally. Not theatrically. They just stopped being people sitting in chairs and became something else entirely. The elderly security guard was named Robert Graves. Gunnery Sergeant Robert Graves, retired 17 years from the Marine Corps, had spent the last decade and a half processing visitors and watching surveillance footage. He was 68 years old with hearing aids and a knee replacement and a pension that came in on the 3rd Thursday of every month. He was also a man who had seen call signs before. Who had seen what they meant. He looked at the shadow box. He looked at Derek. He looked at the photograph and saw the eyes in the photo match the eyes of the woman now descending the staircase from the 4th floor. Graves walked to the center of the lobby. His uniform was blue and embroidered with a Cedar Creek logo. It was not the uniform that mattered. What mattered was how he moved in it, the same fluid certainty that turns fabric into authority. His voice came out at parade ground volume. Not shouting. Better than that. Speaking in the tone that carries across kilometers of open ground and makes people stop what they're doing. Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. Decorated for valor in 17 combat extractions. This woman saved lives we don't have the clearance to discuss. The room went dead silent. 10 full seconds. That's a long time. In 10 seconds, your heart beats approximately 750 times. In 10 seconds, a person can think about their entire life. In 10 seconds, the air in a lobby can become so thick you could perform surgery in it. Derek was crying. Not the loud kind. The kind that happens when you finally understand something you've been carrying without knowing what it was. A Marine colonel named Stephen Pierce was visiting his daughter on the 3rd floor. She was in post-op recovery from an appendectomy. He heard Graves's voice from the stairwell and came down to investigate the commotion. He was 56 years old, built like a piece of military architecture, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved from stone and regret. He saw the shadow box. He saw the photograph. He saw the call sign. His phone was in his pocket. He'd been a logistics officer for 31 years. He knew people. Not in the personal sense. In the institutional sense. The kind of knowing that opens doors that aren't supposed to open. He dialed a number that was no longer supposed to exist. A Pentagon direct line. The kind of number that doesn't appear in any database and works perfectly anyway. Sir, I'm at Cedar Creek Medical in San Antonio. I have a situation involving a decorated officer who has been terminated under false pretenses. Fraud appears to be involved. The acting antagonist is Dr. Richard Caldwell, Chief of Cardiology. 3 sentences. That's all it took to change the vector of everything. By 8:56 p.m., a 2-star general landed at the hospital. Not in a helicopter. Not with fanfare. He simply appeared in the lobby wearing dress blues and carrying a manila envelope so classified that the edges looked like they'd been sealed with authority. His name was General Marcus Hollingsworth, but that was almost irrelevant. What mattered was that he was now in the lobby, and what he carried mattered more than anything Dr. Caldwell had ever collected. The general's voice was quiet, which meant it reached every corner of the room. "Master Chief O'Brien, I need to read something to you. For the record. And for these witnesses." He opened the envelope. The papers inside had redactions so extensive they looked like they'd been attacked with a marker. But some words were visible. Some numbers. Some details. Operation Mountain Shadow, Baghdad Province, 2007. Combat extraction of wounded Marines from a fire-suppressed compound. Extraction team, 6 operators. Primary Extraction Officer, Master Chief Megan O'Brien, call sign Archangel. Casualties sustained, 0. Enemy engagement, 17 minutes. Distance, 3.4 kilometers through active hostile fire. Marines extracted, 12. Rounds of small arms fire engaged, 1,487. Marine Marcus Webb, call sign Iceman, sustained catastrophic injuries during extraction. Primary care provider during transport, Master Chief O'Brien. The general paused. Let that sit. She carried him for kilometers through enemy fire. His blood on her uniform. His life in her hands. When they reached the extraction point, she did not let go until the flight surgeon took him from her arms. Marcus Webb was in the ICU. That's where he'd been since Megan saved his life 5 hours earlier. A nurse had wheeled him down to the lobby on orders from the administrative team. Nobody questioned it. Authority had arrived, and authority apparently wanted the patient present. He gripped Megan's hand. And then, for the first time in 16 years, he made a sound like her name. Not words. Something beyond words. A sound that contained recognition and gratitude and the memory of blood and fire and a woman's voice saying his name in Baghdad while the world burned. The room did not break down. The room did something much more profound. The room understood. At 8:02 p.m., federal investigators arrived. Not local police. Federal. The kind of investigators who carry credential cases and move with the efficiency of people who have already won. They did not come for Megan. They came for Dr. Richard Caldwell. He was in his office on the 5th floor. Scrolling through email. Probably thinking about dinner. Probably thinking about how he'd successfully eliminated the threat to his operation and covered his tracks with institutional leverage and false documentation. The investigators found him at his desk. What followed did not require Megan's presence. What followed was merely the machinery of consequence operating exactly as designed. The investigators had recordings of the phone calls. They had documentation of the fraudulent Medicare billing. They had the fabricated Texas Medical Board complaint. They had the contract with the private investigator. They had 16 months of predatory billing on cardiac imaging for patients like Marcus Webb, patients who needed the genuine procedure but for whom Caldwell had ordered duplicates and triplicates, each generating insurance reimbursements, each a small felony stacked against the others. They escorted him from the building at 9:02 p.m. Local news had already arrived. Photographers and cameras flooded the lobby. Caldwell's hand shook like wind was moving them from the outside. His expensive suit hung loose. His confidence had evaporated. He looked smaller somehow. Like authority had been a costume that no longer fit. A reporter shouted, "Doctor, is it true you fired a Navy Cross recipient to cover insurance fraud?" He didn't answer. The investigators guided him past the cameras, past the staff, past Megan O'Brien standing at attention in borrowed scrubs, her posture perfect, her expression unmoved. 6 months later, a nurse named Jennifer Torres was attending a CPR recertification class at Austin Community College. The instructor was teaching in the basement of the medical building, room 047, a space that smelled like old linoleum and fluorescent tubes humming their endless fluorescent song. She recognized him immediately. Dr. Richard Caldwell was teaching chest compressions on a plastic dummy. His name tag said Richard C., instructor. He was being paid $15 an hour. His hands shook as he demonstrated the technique, the movements mechanical and uncertain, like someone teaching a skill he no longer remembered how to perform with conviction. A student asked if he was okay. He didn't answer. His phone buzzed. Parole officer appointment reminder. The student waited. Dr. Caldwell just nodded and continued the demonstration, hands trembling against plastic ribs that would never breathe again, never need his care, never require his expertise. Jennifer Torres watched from the doorway for exactly 12 seconds. Then she left. Some things don't require commentary. Cedar Creek Medical held a ceremony in the lobby at 2:36 p.m. on a Thursday in April. General Hollingsworth was present. The new hospital administrator was present. Derek was present, his face streaked with tears he'd earned the right to shed. The general pinned the medals back onto Megan's uniform. Not dress blues. A new set of scrubs, navy, with a nameplate that read Director of Emergency Medicine. Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. We don't always get to publicly recognize the work you've done. But today, we do. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for choosing to stay in the fight. Marcus Webb sat in his wheelchair beside her. His working hand was pressed over the tattoo of her name, finally understanding the woman who had carried him home through Baghdad when he was bleeding out in her arms. When the world was fire and he was dying and she would not let him fall. Megan's voice was quiet. Which made it carry. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because they needed help. Just like Marcus needed help 5 hours ago. Like everyone needs help. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She looked at the assembled staff. At the cameras. At her son. That's all it ever was. The ceremony ended. The cameras left. The lobby returned to the ordinary functions of a hospital, admitting patients, processing insurance, moving gurneys down corridors, the constant work of keeping people alive. Megan returned to the ICU in her new uniform, the nameplate catching light. She checked on Marcus Webb. She reviewed the charts of 3 new cardiac patients. She moved through the floor with the same competence she'd always demonstrated, with the added weight of no longer hiding who she was. On her new desk upstairs, in the director's office, the tarnished Baghdad challenge coin sat in a place of honor. No longer hidden in a scrub pocket. No longer pressed against her chest where nobody could see it. The coin that had fallen on concrete. The coin that had come home. The coin that had waited. If you've made it this far, you know what it means to trust someone you've underestimated. You know what it means to stand next to someone who's been carrying more than you realized. Subscribe for more stories about the people among us who've earned the right to be heard. Like this video. Share it. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever misjudged someone only to discover they were exactly what you needed?